I'm Pat Doris. Welcome to The Story. I'm so glad you're here. Congratulations on making it to Friday. All the ways to contact us right there on your screen. You can email us. The address is thestory@kgw.com. You can also give us a call and leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 503-226-5090. We love it when you connect with us and tell us what you're thinking about. We really do want this to be a two-way dialogue. We're starting in Corbett because we're going to be talking about power lines and trees and fire. And this summer could be the worst one yet.
But if the weather does turn and it has strong winds, low humidity, vegetation has low moisture content, and how our agency partners are positioning themselves, that is when we would have those criteria to say, let's turn off the power.
Bill Mesner is the Director of Wildfire Mitigation and Resiliency for Portland General Electric. He said the company is spending tens of millions of dollars to keep tree branches away from power lines because a broken branch could short out a power line, making it spark in the air and ignite other nearby branches, or take the power line to the ground where it sparks and creates a fire.
You know, there is bare conductor, there is covered wire, which we call tree wire, and that is, you know, an insulation around the wire. So that is part of our strategy as well, but we're moving into that strategy. That is not going to happen overnight. This is going to take years for us to do those investments to minimize this risk for our community.
So there are some, I think I heard what you're saying is there's some places that have that special covering when
Yes.
you know it's going through a lot of trees.
Right.
But there are other places that have old wire that doesn't have that yet.
That's correct.
The company recently released its high-risk fire zone map for 2022, and it's grown to include 10 areas. Each of those color markings on the map are locations where PGE will be watching to see if conditions are right for shutting off the power this summer. That bright green area in the middle is the West Hills of Portland. Looking to the left side of the map, you see it includes the Tualatin Mountains in light blue, then more areas just north of Highway 26, which PGE calls the Northwest Hills. Also the forest east and south of Forest Grove. And those brown areas are north of Sheridan and west and south of Willamina. On the right side of the map, it includes the Columbia River Gorge, the Mount Hood corridor, which stretches from Sandy up and over the mountain, areas north and east of Oregon City and south of Estacada and east of Silverton. 10 areas in all, covering as many as 30,000 customers. Each will be under scrutiny as a dry summer or fall storm approaches. It's a big change from just 2 years ago when PGE had one high-risk fire zone in Oregon. It's the one that stretched from the town of Sandy east to Mount Hood, and PGE used it and shut down power in that area during a hot windstorm in early September of 2020, and there were no fires in that area. But to the south, the massive Beachy Creek fire roared to life, pushed by the same hot storm. It raced through the Santiam Canyon and many other areas. The fire eventually covered 192,000 acres, destroyed 1,300 structures, and killed 5 people. Later, a class action lawsuit accused a second company, Pacific Power, of playing a role in the fire, arguing some of its power lines added to the blaze because Pacific Power did not shut down its lines. In 2021, the Oregon legislature required power companies to identify high-risk areas and establish plans to help keep them safe. And as a result, PGE now has those 10 areas on that map. Pacific Corp, also known as Pacific Power, also generated a similar map for 2022 and identified 13 areas. They're shown here in the yellow and include both rural and urban areas of Hood River, as well as areas west and south of Medford.
So these weather stations are allowing us to have really good situational awareness.
PGE is placing remote weather stations in each of its high-risk fire zones to get constant updates on conditions in each location. And PGE meteorologists and fire experts will monitor approaching storms from their new multi-million-dollar facility in the Portland area, where operators can kill power to specific locations with the push of a button. Bill Mesner from PGE says the communities that will be impacted will get warnings through the media and emergency alerts.
We will implement our incident command center about 7 days in advance, right? So we're seeing that weather. So we're starting to monitor it. We're not telling everybody what's going on yet because we don't know if it's going to happen. And then we have criteria that we would tell our public safety partners that, hey, this looks like it's going to happen. And then we're going to lean in and start telling our customers as well. And that's about 72 hours out. And then we do a 48 and 24, 4 hour, and then, hey, your power's off.
By the way, PGE has a live map that will show areas that are under a wildfire shutdown. You're looking at it right now. We'll remind you about it as we get closer to summer. It doesn't show anything right now, but I did want you to be aware of it. How do you measure bias in policing? It's apparently a lot harder than you might guess. Portland city leaders commissioned an independent review to document whether there's racial and political bias within the Portland Police Bureau. And now they're frustrated with what they got back, criticizing the review for not going deep enough. One of the many launching points for this was when Commissioner Joanne Hardesty was falsely identified as a hit-and-run suspect last spring. In that case, the officer who leaked the inaccurate information to the media was fired. Investigative reporter Evan Watson looked through this report and explains why city leaders think it fell flat.
I'm not really sure what to make of this report. We've paid you for it. You've provided it. It doesn't meaningfully impact anything. And there's still, as I say, there's some good recommendations in here that all intend to continue to move forward on. But I don't think we really address the core issue.
Last spring, Portland leaders asked the independent OIR group to investigate the community perception of racial bias, political bias, and a resistance to change within the Portland Police Bureau. Investigators said they found some disturbing incidents.
Consideration that they were jokes, or to highlight a in-custody death case and suggest by mimicking T-shirts that the conduct was tolerable and okay. So there was that undercurrent that was certainly identified.
A Portland police officer's false identification of City Council member Joanne Hardesty as a hit-and-run suspect helped spark the review.
What was striking to me in doing that investigation was that it wasn't just one individual that leaked information. It was actually 5 city employees that leaked information in various situations.
But despite that information, Hardesty herself says she's frustrated with the results of the review.
I am profoundly disappointed. This is not what I asked for, and it does not give us a roadmap moving forward.
Mike Janacco with OIR Group says there's a community perception of racial and political bias within the Bureau.
Portland, you have a problem. The community recognizes you have a problem, and the recommendations are intended to address the problem.
But he said his team can't answer whether officer policies and actions are driven by these root causes or not. That's what left Mayor Wheeler wanting more in the wake of the false identification of Hardesty.
And what do we need to do to change to prevent it from ever happening again? That was the genesis of this report. And it didn't meet my expectations.
City leaders didn't vote on the study results, choosing to just take the information as is and move on.
Evan joins us now. One of the things that I'm wondering that I did not hear in the report is, did they find bias or not in the police bureau?
Investigators were tasked with seeing if that bias is driving or part of the policies or the actions of the officers, but ultimately at the end of the day, they said they couldn't make the determination if it is or if it isn't, which is what led to a lot of the frustration on the city leadership side.
I can imagine. All right, and there were recommendations moving forward. Is the city embracing any of those?
Among those recommendations were stricter punishment for officers associated with hate groups, more community non-law enforcement training to do more with the racial disparity data. But ultimately, multiple commissioners said, hey, we're already aware and working and doing a lot of this. And so they felt there wasn't too many action items moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Evan. Good stuff as always. Meanwhile, a relatively new program in Portland that sends trained mental health workers, not police, to calls involving mental health issues is getting rave reviews. It's called Portland Street Response. It's been operating for about a year now, and by many accounts, it's been a runaway success. Workers with the team are sent to nonviolent calls for people in crisis or people who just need some help out on the street. The report from the Portland State University presented to the council this week took a close look at how the team has done. The report showed that the neighborhoods where street response was active actually saw a 4% reduction in total calls that would have gone to police. Also a 27% reduction in police response on non-emergency welfare checks. The Portland Street Response was dispatched to more than 900 calls. None of them resulted in arrests. Researchers also found people feel good about the team. That includes people who need the help, the general public, and even other first responders. Researchers say this is a good way to build relationships with people who need help.
The core mission is the stabilization on the streets, meeting people where they're at in that first response. the value add of the ability to have follow-up care, peer support specialists, community health workers, is that there's that continuity of care, that if you have a first response, it ends there. You can't go beyond that. With Portland Street Response, some of those calls end there, but they also have the opportunity to connect someone to services, both on the team, outside of the team. And what we always find with mental health services is that it's those gaps that occur where you lose people. So the fact that we have that ability to connect, the program has the ability to connect with people throughout that process, means that there's more likelihood that that person actually gets connected to the services they need, and that it doesn't end on the street.
Researchers say Portland Street Response should remain a non-enforcement tool. That means they cannot force people into any kind of services or force them off the street into shelters. Street Response started in the Lentz neighborhood and then expanded into the entire city earlier this year. And Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler says he's impressed by what he's seen, and he wants to expand the program even more now. He's proposing $8.5 million for Street Response in the spring budget to allow them to hire more people and work 24/7. The other city council members have supported expanding the Street Response team in the past. We'll let you know how it goes this time.
For years, Oregon and Washington both had big backlogs of untested rape kits, depriving victims of justice. Now, Oregon has caught up, but Washington still has some work to do.
We owe it to those survivors to make sure that we get the information, we get it correctly.
When the story continues.
Welcome back. Whether you're watching us live or later, we do want to hear from you. Keep sending your questions and comments to thestory@kgw.com or give us a call and leave a voicemail at 503-226-5090. Let me know what you think. What do you think about wildfires? Do you feel like we're prepared? Are you worried about those energy companies shutting off your power as a storm arrives? It's a big question. There's a lot to talk about. Also, Street Response. Let me know what you think about that. Good program, bad? What are you thinking about that? All right. You might remember that we reported that Oregon worked through a backlog of untested rape kits in late 2018. Well, Washington State now is trying to get through its own backlog of kits, some of which have been sitting on the police department shelves for years. The State Patrol says they've made great progress, but also they're going to miss an upcoming deadline. Here's Drew Mickelson.
Lawmakers admit they set a pretty ambitious deadline for the Washington State Patrol, and WSP says it's about 95% of the way to meeting those demands. They have made a lot of progress. In 2018, the state identified approximately 10,000 untested DNA rape test kits stuck in a crime lab backlog. But thanks to increased funding, that number is now closer to 1,700. And in 2019, it took the state on average 682 days, nearly 2 years, to process a kit. Legislators said that was unacceptable and forced them to process all the kits within 45 days by May 1st, 2022. The state says it's not quite there, thanks to COVID. Robots now process most of the DNA samples in a newly expanded facility in Clark County, Washington. It opened in the spring of 2020. Remember the spring of 2020? COVID shutdowns and delays caused the State Patrol's crime lab some issues, including getting the robots physically to the lab.
They weren't able to be delivered in the time frame that we had thought because they were the actual models were diverted to other labs to do COVID testing.
Still, WSP says great progress has been made. For years, the state processed the tests by hand, resulting in a backlog into the thousands. Some unprocessed kits sat on the shelves in police departments for years, more than a decade in some cases.
Appreciate everybody's leadership.
But following a series of new laws, state and federal funding aimed at tackling the problem resulted in that Vancouver crime lab and the new benchmark that by this Sunday, May 1st, 2022, all kits had to be processed within 45 days.
We're confident in saying that 90 to 95% of every new sample that comes in will be able to turn around in that 45-day benchmark, and we're confident saying that that's going to only get better with every single month.
When we picked the 45 days, we knew it was a big lift, and we said, what do you need? And I feel like, you know, despite COVID, despite some of the challenges they face, they really are getting us so close.
Representative Tina Orwell headed up most of the test kit legislation. She says she understands the delay.
I know by the end of the year, that chapter will be closed. And thanks to our new tracking system, the high throughput lab, this will never happen again in our state where they'll sit on a shelf and be forgotten.
The robots process the tests now 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at a much higher rate than the old hands-on system. The State Patrol says the 45-day benchmark should be met by the end of the year.
We owe it to those survivors to make sure that we get the information, we get it correctly.
That newly expanded crime lab only processes the incoming rape kits, about 200 a month. The other 1,700 that are still outstanding, those are being sent to labs outside of the state of Washington.
That was Drew Mickelson from our Seattle station. Way to go, you Vancouver Crime Lab folks. Hey, many of you who live in East Portland are probably familiar with just how dangerous 82nd Avenue can be. Well, now the city is taking over control of the road from the state, and that deal includes some major funding needed for upgrades. We'll take a look when the story continues. The Portland City Council gave final approval this week to transfer a 7-mile stretch of the notoriously hazardous and crash-prone 82nd Avenue from the Oregon Department of Transportation to the Portland Bureau of Transportation. That moves it from state control to local control. The 5-lane thoroughfare in East Portland is one of a handful of so-called orphan highways in the metro area. They call them that because they used to be the high-speed backbones of the city's road system, but then freeways like I-5 and 205 took over that role. But highways like 82nd Avenue have remained under state control even as the city grew up and filled in around them. The result is that 82nd is larger and faster than most of the other roads in Portland, and it lacks many of the things you would normally find on a main street in a dense urban area like, well, frequent crosswalks and safety features to deter speeding. And that makes it one of the most dangerous roads in all of Portland.
From 2015 to 2019, there were nearly 2,000 crashes on 82nd. That's nearly one per day, with 76 people killed or seriously injured, nearly 15 per year. Most of those killed were people crossing the street.
For many local residents, the issue goes just beyond traffic safety. The road has become hazardous, and it's become a symbol of geographic division and neglect in East Portland.
82nd Avenue has been such a dividing line for so many years. Both in terms of race as well as class and health impacts. And as we know, it's one of the most racially diverse areas of our state, with countless stores, immigrant-owned small businesses, schools, restaurants.
Residents and safety advocates have been sounding the alarm for years. But the transfer to Portland was a real drawn-out process that required action at the state legislative level. Part of the difficulty is that 82nd needs hundreds of millions of dollars in repairs and upgrades to bring it up to code. Well, that's more work than the city can afford to take on. So that's why the transfer deal includes $80 million allocated by the state for initial round of upgrades, and they're going to be using federal funding from the American Rescue Plan. The city of Portland's also pledged to allocate an additional $35 million for the corridor, and then ODOT says it will kick in another $70 million starting in 2026. Now, for the people who live, work, and travel along 82nd, the upgrades cannot come soon enough. Heidi Schultz's son, Dawson, attends Leotis McDaniel High School on Northeast 82nd, which reopened in September after a 2-year renovation. Heidi said she and other parents recently formed a safety committee to try to address the traffic hazards and the crime around the reopened campus.
There's a lot of speeding, a lot of running red lights. I mean, the scope of safety issues on 82nd obviously go beyond PBOT's jurisdiction, but some of the issues that have been brought up are the shootings that are happening frequently and in front of the school or near the school during school hours. There's a question of, could we put cameras at a light north of school? Could we do things that somehow deter this kind of behavior?
So it is dangerous. You have to just be on alert. And most of my friends, they just all know you never jaywalk that street. You never just run across it even if it looks empty, because you never know when someone could just come speeding down the way.
It is definitely dangerous. Some of the planned upgrades should start to roll out soon. The transfer is scheduled to take effect on June 1st, and because of the initial $80 million in federal funding, PBOT has a deadline of 2026, about 4 years from now, to get the initial round of improvements done. Well, if you missed our show earlier this week, we've been doing coverage of our first debate between the governor candidates. We hosted a debate with the Portland City Club between the Democratic frontrunners, that's House Speaker Tina Kotek and State Treasurer Tobias Reed. Along with their plans for tackling the big issues, the housing crisis, gun violence, and others, it was also a good chance to get to know the candidates themselves a little bit better, especially in the lightning round.
Tina, what's your vision as governor in one word?
Opportunity.
Tobias.
If we can have a phrase, I would say shared ambition.
Okay, 2 words. That's all right. Yeah. And Tobias, what is the last book you read?
Oh, the last book was a fiction book called Great Circle about a woman who was an aviator in the 50s, 30s, 40s, 50s.
Tina, last book?
I have a lot of books half read, but the one I actually finished most recently was Being Mortal by Otoko Wande.
Good book.
And your favorite restaurant in Oregon, Tina?
Oh, there's too many. I'm going to name my favorite in North Portland, which would be Swift and Union.
And Tobias?
Top Burmese.
And your favorite pandemic binge watch, Tobias?
The Durrells in Corfu, a PBS masterpiece series.
Tina?
Midnight Mass on Netflix.
You can watch highlights from the debate tonight on Straight Talk. That's coming up at 6:30. Or if you really want to get into it, go watch the entire 75-minute debate. It's up on our KGW YouTube page right now. By the way, we're going to have the next debate, the Republican candidates, next Tuesday. That'll be including Christine Drazen, Bud Pierce, Bridget Barton, Stan Pulliam, and Jessica Gomez. It's Tuesday at noon. It'll be broadcast online on KGW.com or our KGW YouTube channel. And we'll have highlights all next week. All right, keep sending your questions and comments to the story at kgw.com. When we come back, I'll read some of the thoughts you've been sharing over the last 25 minutes. For this week's Hey Help campaign, we're asking you to donate to Outsiders Inn. They're a nonprofit based in Vancouver that helps run one of the city's new safe stay communities. It's a way for homeless people to get off the street and live in an organized village. If you want to donate, just hold your phone's camera right now to the QR code there on your screen, or you can go to kgw.com/heyhelp. All right, this is one of the big times of the night where we read your emails that you've been sending in live here. Jim says on the power lines and the fires, he says, put the power lines underground. Jim, it's a great point. PGE told me that they are working on that, but it's going to take them some time, and it is, oh my, so very expensive. Also, Dan says, hip, hip, hooray for Portland street response. I think a lot of people are saying that. It's been wildly successful, and it's probably just going to expand. Hey, thanks for joining us. That's our show for tonight. Remember, the story, our story, well, that never ends. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.